Humankind stands on the edge of the interactive age. You have come a long way. But are you ready for the future?
Introducing Sega Saturn. Hit it.
The Sega Saturn was a 5th generation console that succeeded its widely more popular predecessor, the Genesis, releasing in the midst of a heated pop culture war between Nintendo's 2D powerhouse and Sega's very own. But due to a slew of financial mishaps, poor advertising, negligence, and seemingly internal conflict in the company's own management and staff, all ultimately led to the demise of not only a greatly undervalued console, but the company's reputation as a whole. This is the story of the Sega Saturn and why it was underrated despite its failings. The Saturn began life as many other consoles did, the logical evolution of the company's previous endeavors. Instead of an add-on for a 60-bit console, make the newest console compact disc oriented. Starting development around the release of the Sega CD around 1992, Sega was surely ahead of the curve, as in this instance, it was the only notable console around this time that had used compact discs that wasn't an add-on. The only other competition was the notorious Philips CDI and a few lesser known ones. The hardware at the time was pretty impressive as well. Though equal in RAM with the PS1, it also had a cartridge slot on the back that could be used to expand the RAM of the system almost double. It was originally going to be used to play Sega Genesis games, but was later scrapped due to quality and pricing issues. Nonetheless, the cartridge slot was required for some games that took a lot more RAM to even be playable, like King of Fighters 95 or Marvel Superheroes. Though some could argue that this unorthodox method was only part of the reason why the Saturn failed. I mean, why did I need to purchase an extra RAM cartridge to play a game like KOF 95, when on the PS1 I simply popped in a disc and played the game, no problem? Did Sega never learn from their mistakes with the Genesis? Overzealousness aside, this method was sort of a double-edged sword. Besides the fact these games were mainly in Japan, because the Saturn fared far better over there than in America, the Saturn tended to run these sprite-based games far better than their previous consoles, and even the PS1. Comparing the graphical improvements on the Saturn and Genesis versions of games like Earthworm Jim 2 and Street Fighter Alpha games on the Sega Saturn to PS1 port, it was clear that the Saturn was a 2D powerhouse that many have come to acknowledge about the console despite its shortcomings. Shortcomings that one could say undoubtedly played a role in the demise of the console. Speaking more on the hardware, the Saturn was an interesting one. That is to say, in some ways it far succeeded its predecessors and contemporaries, but in other ways it clearly fell flat. As mentioned before, the Saturn often played 2D games far better than the other consoles around this time. It was all due to the fact that the dual VDP GPU chip allowed for greater display of the graphics and much faster draw speed than that of the PS1, a console itself that also had a pretty unorthodox way in which it handled sprite-based games. The rendering process that console took was separate from its main processing engine, as the engine was mainly designed for 3D polygonal graphics, so of course it wouldn't look as good or play as good as the Saturn, a system with a core processor designed for these sprite-based games. It's pretty ironic when you think about it. Sega went into making the Saturn as a 2D based console, seeing 3D as just a fad and an afterthought, while Sony with the PS1 saw the incoming revolution of 3D graphics, seeing the 2D style as an outdated thing of the past. And for many, the sales spoke for themselves. One capitalized and one slowly ran itself into the ground, before they could even get a footing, before collapsing altogether, creating a spiral down that greatly affected Sega's next console, the Dreamcast. Of course, reports of Sony's new console back in '93 had a hand in shaping some aspects of the direction of the Saturn's development to keep up with said competition, despite Sega at the time not being fully aware of Sony's console's new power. They delayed the release of the console a bit to incorporate a new video processor that will not only improve the functionality of how it handled 2D, which Sega at the time knew the PS1 wasn't as proficient in, but also added a new VDP, which allowed for more optimization in 3D graphics, such as texture mapping. These efforts were all made possible due to Sega collaborating with a Japanese-based technological company known as Hitachi, whom Sega struck a deal with at the time, a company that was greatly integral to the Saturn's development, as they created the Super H2, or SH2 for short, which was a 32-bit processing core which was initially used in the 32X and Capcom's own CPS3. The chip allowed for almost one-to-one arcade-to-console translation at times, with some even having online play, though not many. Speaking of online, the Saturn was the only 5th generation console to even have it, predating the Dreamcast, PS2, and Xbox, which utilized it in even greater ways. Like I said, Sega was ahead of the curve in this aspect as well. The PS1 only had link cables and the N64 had a short-lived internet service via the failed disk drive expansion that released 4 years after the console had already been out. The Saturn had this feature as early as '96. While somewhat expensive, starting at $199 or being released as a bundle for $300, it basically started the framework of what would be modern console online play that later systems in the 6th, 7th, and 8th generation consoles would adopt. It was similar to the Sega MegaNet used in the Mega Drive, which utilized dial-up internet functionality to call and connect to people who you wanted to play with. Though in Japan, like many things about the Saturn, the online functionality was way better, as instead you connected to an actual traditional server named the Sega Net, the same Sega Net that would later be used for the Dreamcast for things such as online play, emails, and downloading DLC. There was only a handful of games released for the console that had online capabilities, some notable ones being Sega Rally Championship or Saturn Bomberman. But the Japanese side had a considerably larger catalog of online games, though still not very much. Though it's no wonder, when over 70% of the damn console's game library was Japanese, they'd get more of the functional online that resembled more of the PC games at the time than that dial-up crap. And speaking of game library, the Saturn, for all the flack given to it, had a pretty godlike game library. One of the best of this era, which is saying something since it went up against the likes of the PS1 and N64. Both consoles that had genre-defining games that shaped and changed the industry. The Saturn itself had plenty of genre-defining, well-made classics that are either overlooked due to one reason or another. Many devs didn't want to create games for the Saturn, due to its unorthodox hardware that was either too weak to run certain games fluidly or simply too hard, while something like the PS1 offered an alternative that was more fine-tuned for 3D, which many devs were heading towards, seeing 2D as a yesteryear thing. But man, the 2D games we did get for this console are not only some of the best looking, but some of the best games ever made, and it'd be unjust to not talk about the great game library that this console had. For many people born around this time, bringing up the games that defined this mid-90s, early 3D era would be a no-brainer. Final Fantasy VII, Mario 64, Crash Bandicoot, Resident Evil, Tekken 3, Superman 64, being some of the games you think when you hear best of the best, or worse in some cases. The Saturn, in a lot of ways, had an equally as engaging and influential library that just never caught the mainstream for one reason or another. Games like Guardian Heroes, which took the oversaturated formula of the beat-em-up genre and truly revolutionized it by combining a standard beat-em-up playstyle with intricate fighting game like movesets and RPG elements. It was a one-of-a-kind game with an interesting story mode that wasn't just shoehorned in. They had as many as 30 endings, a multiplayer mode that was even more chaotic than Smash, which this game predates by 3 years. The developer of this game, Treasure, is a very underrated one that created some of the best games on the Genesis, like the hard to master but fun Alien Soldier and Gunstar Heroes, and even Sin and Punishment on the N64. Guardian Heroes was the next logical step for them from the 16-bit era, pioneering a new style of beat 'em up that's rarely seen today. You can definitely see the influence of this game with more popular titles, like the popular indie title Castle Crashers, and even the PS1 had a game derivative of it. This game was excellent, but like any good beat 'em up, very challenging, so if you aren't skillful and don't use the game's combat systems and RPG mechanics like this isn't a hybrid of the two, you could have a very troubling time. Guardian Heroes was a masterclass game, and the genre it pioneered, with stellar graphics and visuals. It's one of the reasons the Saturn as a console was worth having, and so underrated if you didn't. Last Bronx was a weapon-based fighting game released in 1996, a few months after Soul Blade's original 1995 release. Though like Battle Arena Toshiden, it was a different take on the weapon-based fighter that became very rampant around this time, with games like Samurai Showdown pioneering it, and even entering the 3D realm to mixed results. Last Bronx was a story of gang warfare, and set itself apart from the fighting games at the time, for not only its more urban setting, but the combat that resembled more of a virtual fighter game and technicality and moveset, along with a cast of characters and art style that represented the 90s urban style it was going for very well. Even though the game isn't as graphically impressive as Soul Edge, or as known as the first Toshiden, Last Bronx showed what the Saturn was capable of 3D wise, because the game honestly looks better than quite a few PS1 titles. It's a game like many of the fighters on the Saturn, showed the system could handle arcade ports and do 3D competently, running games that weren't just polygonal blobs. Since the Saturn was more geared towards 2D in a 32-bit era, it had some of the best looking sprite games of that generation that look way better than the early 3D games of the time, as sprite games tend to age better than developing 3D. It typically started to look outdated in a year or two. Take the first Resident Evil and the second one for example. And nothing quite proved the visual staying power of the 2D based games of that era on the Saturn quite like Princess Crown, an action RPG developed by Atlas that, similar to Guardian Heroes, combined a side-scrolling playstyle with RPG elements. Though this game could be better compared to the Tales of series, as it's more of an RPG with action elements than Guardian Heroes, which was a beat 'em up with RPG elements. Just looking at this game, and again, you can easily see it's one of the most beautifully made sprite-based 2D games of not just this era, but of all time. A very rare game, not only in sales because it sold so poorly, but sheer visuals as well. A sprite-based game didn't impress me this much till the likes of KOF 13, and that game came out like 13 years after this one. Although this game never got an English port, it did later get ported to the PS4 and VanillaWare's latest game, 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. Princess Crown was definitely an underrated gem in a sea of underratedness that is the Saturn's game library. A beautifully looking RPG with combat, although on the simple side from what I've been able to play, it still managed to keep me intrigued with just how the game played and looked. And speaking of RPGs on the Sega Saturn, there's no way I could conceive this video without talking about the true apex of the console, that of course being Panzer Dragoon Saga. A game that unfortunately does need an introduction. Wish we lived in an age where this game was just as known as the likes of Final Fantasy or even Brave Fencer Musashi. Panzer Dragoon Saga was the third and final entry in the original Panzer Dragoon trilogy, where it started as a series of rail shooters, evolved into a game that combined the fast movement of those earlier titles with a unique RPG battle system. As in this game, movement played a huge factor in choosing when to attack your opponent. You couldn't just stay in one area and mash attack, like a lot of more less demanding RPGs, let's say. The story of the game, an intriguing one, that like all of the Panzer Dragoon games, you can clearly see the Nausicaa influence, which apparently people don't realize this series was influenced from. I've always considered this franchise a video game equivalent of that movie and manga, and it really shows in this game, as you're now able to walk around and traverse and talk to NPCs and do side quests. A night and day cycle that influences what you can do and who you can speak to at certain times of the day, predating even the likes of games that would heavily incorporate features such as that in the future. You were no longer just bound to the automated run and gunning of previous games. Now you could actually interact with the environment and get better versed in the world of a franchise that actually has a lot of intriguing lore behind it, like never before. This game was a gamble, and it originally wasn't even going to get an English release, but someone at Sega fought for it. It may not have initially paid off, but in the long run, it showed the truly revolutionary nature of the Sega Saturn, having a library of games that didn't meet the mainstream eye due to it being on a failed console, but were still fantastic games nonetheless, making Panzer Dragoon Saga to me undoubtedly the apex of not only the Panzer Dragoon series, but also the Saturn as a whole. A feat not easy, as the Saturn had no shortage of phenomenal games. There's plenty of great games here on the Saturn, overlooked, never looked, or they actually succeeded. I mean, the Saturn gave birth to plenty of Sega's best franchises that would have longevity over time. From the aforementioned Panzer Dragoon series to Soccer Wars, one of the more known examples of a successful Saturn game. Hell, the Shining series, Shining Force 3 in particular, is a very great game with some of the most intricate tactical combat of the genre, with a really cool story too. It even predates the whole multiple scenario release at a different date that Final Fantasy will later adopt with Final Fantasy X, X-2, and the 13 games. Easily one of the best tactical RPGs of that era. Knights, probably the most known game from this system that did eventually get a sequel on the Wii. Game catalog wise, the Saturn sure as hell did no wrong. It had staying power and a strong array of great games to boot, which begs the question, why? Why did the Saturn fail? And did it really mark the beginning of the end for Sega? Or did Sega initially screw up with the release of the CD and all those other peripherals? Well, let's answer those questions. Now, the exact reason the Saturn failed has been a widely discussed topic for decades, but the truth isn't just one solid reason, but a spiraling down of corporate greed, dishonesty, competition, and seemingly internal conflict in Sega's own divisions that led to the failure of a console that should have done so much better. The console initially launched in November of 1994 in Japan, with a strong lineup of games, including the original Panzer Dragoon and Virtua Fighter. But then the geniuses over at Sega released the 32X, a peripheral for the Genesis for people who couldn't afford a Saturn. It allowed the Genesis to play 32-bit games at about half the price of the Saturn, but for some brilliant reason, it couldn't even play those Saturn games as ports, which was a huge missed opportunity that probably wouldn't have saved the 32X, but made it at least a more viable option for people who couldn't afford the Saturn. Instead, they made an already obsolete add-on the day it came out even more obsolete by releasing a bunch of games little to nobody played. Though most developers didn't want to make games for a filler add-on anyways, that's why the library of games was so lackluster even after a 2-year period when they got discontinued. It's pretty funny though, that the 32X almost sold 1 million units despite it having literally everything against it. Being released as a filler peripheral the same week as the Saturn surely wouldn't backfire. It's sad to think that maybe if Sega didn't split the development of the 32X with the Saturn and instead used that time and resources to perfect the 3D on the Saturn, what could have been? A better optimized console that wasn't competing with a pointless add-on from the exact same company. What was originally meant to extend a 4th generation's console's lifespan into the 5th generation for another year or two for some odd reason would affect player trust in the Saturn, despite the 32X being technically better than the CD add-on. As I briefly referenced before, earlier in the video, there was internal conflict between Sega of America and Japan that hurt the Saturn the most, more than anything. Not because there wasn't a mainline Sonic game, not even because of the high price. The true reason the Saturn failed is simply because of the unprofessionalism displayed by Sega, mainly Sega of Japan. See, back when the Genesis was just getting started, it was struggling to even sell 1 million units. That was until Sega of Japan CEO at the time, Haya Nakayama, appointed a new Sega of America CEO by the name of Tom Kalinske. His plan undoubtedly helped to boost sales, not only for the Genesis having it bundled with Sonic 1, but made Sonic a household name in America. Japan's marketing at the time simply wasn't as good, and they failed to make Sonic as iconic and popular over there as he had been in America and ever since. Hell, the executives of Japan at the time would have fired Tom if he was working for them, but since he was the head of America and Europe, he managed to achieve what Sega of Japan thought was never gonna happen. Rival and surpass Nintendo and make a mascot easily as recognizable as Nintendo's very own. I bring all of this up to illustrate a point, because this wasn't just an isolated incident. There was a clear disconnect between the American and Japanese divisions of Sega that would play a great role in the demise of the console. See, back in the early development stage of the Saturn, Silicon Graphics founder Jim Clark hit up Sega about a new graphics chip they had been developing that would be perfect for a game console. Sega of Japan, however, instantly shut down the deal for the issues the graphics chip had, such as poor audio, low frame rate, etc. Silicon Graphics would soon fix these issues, but Sega of Japan would still shut them down, for no other reason besides the fact it was Sega of America's deal with another American company, that no matter how good the deal actually was, would make the Japanese division look incompetent in the process. Sega of Japan's own reluctance to accept an offer hurt the Saturn tremendously, as Silicon Graphics would later partner with Nintendo on the N64, giving the system its signature look with 3D and making it one of the most powerful consoles of the generation, skipping 32-bit entirely, far surpassing what the Saturn was putting out. It was mere pride that stopped a great deal from transpiring, that in many ways solidified the beginning of the end for a console, before it even got to shelves. Another instance of this negligence that cemented the failure of the Saturn was again due to Sega of Japan. After Nintendo portrayed Sony with the prospect of working on a new console in a joint effort, Sony would later contact Sega. Sega of Japan would again decline, against the American division's wishes. Just think about that for a second. If Sega of Japan hadn't been so reluctant, they could have single-handedly prevented the greatest opposition, the PS1, and instead make a console with Sony that would have been just as powerful with an equally as strong library as the PS1 and Saturn combined. It would have been fucking crazy. Sega literally had the one chance to prevent that greatest downfall. But again, the Japanese division just thought too highly of themselves, were jealous of the American division, and plans to co-op with Sony were outright tossed aside. It's even more ironic when you think about it, because the release of the PS1 made Sega release the Saturn ahead of schedule in America, as it was originally slated to release September of 1995, which then became May of 1995. This out of the blue change in date and Sega shipping at least 30,000 units to retailers without informing them prior forced many to drop Sega altogether. Another very foolish business decision among the many on this list. I mean, the very same console Sega had the potential to prevent even being made and potentially partnering with the company had them shook literally a year later. If that isn't sheer irony, I don't know what is. Sega of Japan is the perfect example of giving something the right tools and still can't get it together. This incompetence and unprofessionalism displayed by Sega would of course lead to a decline of consumer and player trust, on top of the high price tag of the system of $399, while a PS1 on the other hand had $299. I'm sure we're all aware of that infamous scene at E3 1995.
$299.
Completely destroyed Sega with just a single phrase. A sad tale indeed. The Sega Saturn, what could have been in the long run, Sega of Japan just took all of the wrong turns they possibly could. I mean, they were also the guys behind the 32X, not Sega of America. Though despite the 32X's shortcomings, the 32X was sort of ahead of its time, in a way. I mean, later companies would try to replicate what Sega did with the Genesis to varying degrees of success, Nintendo with the disc drive, Sony with the PlayStation Move, the Kinect. I feel as though if the 32X had come out at a later date with its own game library, which I'm pretty sure was the intent of the Sega Neptune, it would have been more fondly remembered, rather than releasing in the same time frame of the Saturn, Sega's hot new console at the time, having the consoles indirectly compete against each other, failing them both in the process. It's just sad to think about what could have been. After a more than successful campaign with the Genesis, the Saturn had everything going for it. Silicone graphics hitting them up, Sony, graphics cards capable of conjuring great 2D, but pride got in the way. It led to the demise of what could have been a great success. The failure of the Saturn was never going to be the end of Sega, like many yell about. Sega was always the leading arcade seller in Japan, which is something Sega of Japan excelled at. Which brings up an interesting dichotomy with the two divisions. Sega of Japan being profound at manufacturing arcades, having high unit sales, along with merchandising that although was popular in America for a time, never reached the crazy popularity it had in Japan that continued for decades and even to this very day. While Sega of America was better at operating the console market, which the Japan division had failed at, not even being able to make the mascot as household of a name as it was in America. It also didn't help that there were even more failed attempts to revitalize the Saturn in the midst of its impending failure, with the likes of the 64-bit expansion pack, named the Sega 64X, or the unreleased Sega Saturn Black Belt and Katana, which would later become the Dreamcast. Both ideas I'm sure came from Sega of Japan, because if you've been following this video, you'd know they're responsible for a lot of bad decisions. And because of those grave miscalculations, lawsuits and a waste of time and money ensued from a company and product that could have avoided such if they co-opted more. When the two divisions came together, they made some tremendous dreams come true. And when the disconnect kicks in, well, you get the story of the Sega Saturn.